You hear that? Kramer's voice cut through the thick afternoon heat, sharp with amusement as he slapped the side of the silent aircraft, the dull metallic thud echoing across the tarmac. That's the sound of a dead engine, and a museum piece that should have stayed buried. The 4 airmen around him laughed, their voices bouncing off the concrete as the sun shimmered in waves above the runway, laptops open on rolling tool carts, screens glowing green with perfect diagnostics that all insisted the same lie: everything was fine, every system nominal, every sensor aligned, and yet the twin engines of the grounded aircraft sat cold and lifeless, their massive blades drooping like something tired of trying. One of them pulled out a phone, casually angling it toward the old man standing a few yards away, capturing the moment like it was entertainment, like it was nothing more than a joke waiting for a punchline. Eli Vance didn't react. He stood with his hands resting lightly at his sides, a faded olive jacket hanging loosely from his shoulders, the fabric worn soft by decades of use, and at his hip, a small leather pouch, creased, darkened, and marked by time, shifted gently in the warm breeze. His eyes weren't on the airman, nor on the officer standing stiffly nearby pretending to maintain control. They were fixed on the aircraft itself, on the subtle stillness of the machine, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. "Sir, this is a restricted maintenance zone," Lieutenant Brandon Wells said, his tone formal but thinly veiled with impatience, stepping closer with the rigid posture of someone new to authority. "I don't know who cleared you to be here, but we have a certified team handling this situation." Kramer smirked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag before tossing it onto the cart. "Yeah, we've got 6 hours of diagnostics, 3 specialists, and a direct line to engineering," he added, glancing at Eli with a sideways grin. "So unless you've got a time machine back to 1968, I think we're good." The others chuckled again, one of them shaking his head as he muttered, "Guy probably thinks engines run on instinct." The aircraft remained silent, the heat pressing down heavier now, the distant hum of other operations carrying faintly across the base but never quite reaching this spot, as if everything here had stalled. "In place." Eli took a slow step forward, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, and for a brief moment, one of the younger airmen, Lucas Reed, felt something shift, something subtle in the air that didn't match the laughter, didn't match the arrogance, like the quiet before a storm that no one else had noticed yet. "We ran every check," Kramer continued, gesturing toward the open panels and exposed components. "Fuel flows clean, ignition's live, pressure's stable, there's nothing wrong with it." Eli stopped near the edge of the aircraft's shadow, his gaze tracing along the engine housing, then up toward the rotor assembly, following lines invisible to everyone else, his expression unchanged, calm, almost distant. "Then why isn't it speaking?" he said quietly, his voice low but carrying just enough weight to cut through the noise, and for a second, just a second, the laughter faltered, hanging in the air like it wasn't sure where to land, before Kramer scoffed and shook his head. "Speaking," he repeated, grinning wider now. "It's a machine, old man, not a ghost." Eli didn't answer, his eyes narrowing slightly as the wind shifted, brushing past the aircraft's frame with a soft, hollow whisper, and somewhere deep in the stillness, something felt off, something small, something precise, something waiting to be seen. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, and then Kramer let out a short laugh, louder this time, forcing the moment to break as he shook his head and stepped past Eli with exaggerated confidence. "You hear that, guys? Now it is supposed to talk to us," he said, tapping the side panel again as if to prove a point, the hollow knock echoing uselessly. "Maybe we should ask it nicely. Or better yet, let the expert hear. Whisper to it." The others chuckled again, but not as easily as before, their laughter thinner, less certain, as the heat pressed down harder and the aircraft sat there unmoving, stubborn in its silence. Lieutenant Wells crossed his arms, glancing between the diagnostic screens and the old man, irritation creeping into his voice. "We are not running a guessing game," he said. "We follow procedure, and procedure says there is no mechanical fault." Eli's gaze remained on the engine housing, steady, patient, as if time moved differently for him, as if 6 hours of failure meant nothing at all. "Procedure only tells you what the system knows," he said quietly, his voice calm, almost distant, "not what the machine feels." Kramer rolled his eyes and leaned against the cart, grabbing a tablet and flicking through the data with sharp, practiced motions. "Machines do not feel," he snapped. "They run on numbers, pressure, voltage, tolerances, all of which are exactly where they should be. He turned the screen toward Eli for a brief second, green indicators lining every column. That is reality. Eli did not even look at the screen. Instead, he stepped closer to the aircraft, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the engine cowling. The metal reflected the harsh sunlight, a dull glare that forced everyone else to squint, but Eli's eyes remained fixed, tracing the surface, following seams and edges that no one else seemed to notice. Lucas Reed shifted his weight, his eyes moving from the screen to Eli, then back to the aircraft, a faint unease settling in his chest. He had been watching the data all morning, watching perfect readings produce nothing, and now watching this old man ignore all of it like it did not matter at all. "Sir," Lucas said cautiously, his voice lower than before, "what do you mean by that?" Eli did not answer immediately. The wind brushed across the tarmac again, carrying a faint metallic rattle from somewhere deep inside the aircraft, so subtle it could have been nothing, so quiet it was easy to miss. Everyone else missed it. Eli did not. His head tilted slightly, just a fraction, like he was listening to a distant echo. "It is not quiet because it is dead," he said at last, almost to himself, "it is quiet because something is holding it back." Kramer pushed off the cart, frustration sharpening his tone. "That does not even make sense," he said, stepping forward. "We checked every panel, every seal, every line, nothing is holding anything back." Eli finally moved his hand, not touching anything yet, just hovering near the side of the engine housing, his fingers inches from a small access panel that looked identical to every other one on the aircraft. Identical, except for one thing. He narrowed his eyes slightly. The edge was too perfect. Lucas felt it again, that same unease, stronger now, like something important was about to surface. "You opened this one?" Eli asked softly. Kramer barely glanced at it. "No need," he said immediately, "system shows no fault in that section, opening it would just create unnecessary work." Eli's hand lowered slowly, his fingers finally brushing against the metal, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to still, the laughter gone, the heat forgotten, the entire scene narrowing down to that single point of contact, as if the aircraft itself had been waiting for someone to notice. The moment Eli's fingers made contact with the panel, the world seemed to narrow, the heat, the voices, even the distant hum of the bass fading into something muted and far away, and for a split second his eyes lost focus, not on the metal beneath his hand, but somewhere far beyond it, somewhere older, somewhere louder, where the air had once been thick with rotor wash and tension instead of stillness, where machines did not fail quietly but demanded to be understood or they took everything down with them, and the faint metallic vibration under his fingertips now echoed something buried deep in memory, something familiar, something wrong in a way no diagnostic screen could ever measure. The tarmac dissolved in his mind into a different kind of heat, heavier, wet, pressing in from all sides, the sound of blades cutting through dense air, uneven, strained, fighting against something unseen, and inside that memory he was not standing still, he was moving, younger, faster, his hand steady despite the chaos around him, eyes scanning not numbers but patterns, not data but behavior, feeling the machine through instinct instead of reading it through code. A small misalignment, barely visible, hidden behind something that looked perfect, something that should not have been touched according to every rule, and yet it was the only thing that mattered. The memory flickered, sharp and brief, and then it was gone, leaving only the present, the silent aircraft, and the weight of every eye now fixed on him. Kramer scoffed again, though there was less certainty in it this time, stepping closer as if to reclaim control of the moment. "You are not seriously going to tell me that panel is the problem," he said, folding his arms tightly, because if it was, the system would have flagged it hours ago. Eli did not look at him. His thumb brushed lightly along the edge of the panel, slow, deliberate, tracing the seam where metal met metal, and then he pressed gently, just enough to feel it, just enough to confirm what his instincts had already told him. "It is not supposed to sit like this," he said quietly. Lieutenant Wells frowned, stepping forward, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in to examine the panel, running his own hand across it, searching for something obvious, something measurable, but finding nothing. "It is flush," he said firmly, pulling his hand back, within tolerance. Eli shook his head once, a small movement, almost imperceptible. "Not to her," he replied. The words hung there, strange and unfamiliar, and for a moment no one spoke. Lucas felt it again, stronger now, that same sense that something important was slipping past them, something they did not know how to see. He looked at the panel, then at Eli, then back at the data screens glowing behind them, and for the first time all day, the numbers felt incomplete. Kramer let out a breath, sharper now, frustration bleeding through. "We are not opening that panel," he said, his voice tightening. "There is no justification, and I am not creating a maintenance report for a problem that does not exist." Eli's hand dropped to his side, but his eyes never left the aircraft. For a moment, it looked like he might step back, like he might walk away and leave them to their perfect readings and silent engines. But he did not move. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint, hollow rattle from deep inside the housing, so soft it barely registered, and yet this time, Lucas heard it too. His head turned sharply, eyes widening just slightly. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. Kramer waved him off immediately. "Thermal expansion," he said dismissively, metal adjusting in the heat. But Lucas was not looking at him anymore. He was looking at Eli, and for the first time, he was not seeing an old man standing on the edge of a restricted zone. He was seeing someone who already knew the answer. Lucas did not realize he had taken a step closer until the gravel shifted beneath his boot, the sound sharp in the growing quiet, and this time no one laughed, no one made a comment, the moment stretching thin as the weight of uncertainty settled over the group like a pressure they could not quite explain, and Lieutenant Wells noticed it too, the subtle shift in posture, the way his team no longer looked entirely sure of themselves, and that unsettled him more than the dead aircraft ever had. "That is enough," Wells said, his voice firmer now, stepping forward to reassert control. "We are not deviating from protocol based on a feeling." Kramer nodded quickly, grateful for the reinforcement, crossing his arms again as if the structure of authority could anchor the situation back into something predictable. "Exactly," he said, glancing at Eli with a tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We solve problems with data, not guesses." Eli remained still, his gaze never leaving the aircraft, but there was a subtle shift in his expression now, something quieter, heavier, as if he had already accepted that they were not ready to see what he saw. The wind moved again, carrying that same faint, hollow rattle, and this time it lingered just a fraction longer, enough for Lucas to feel it in his chest more than hear it, like a vibration that did not belong. He swallowed, glancing toward Kramer, then back at the panel, his uncertainty turning into something closer to concern. "Sir," Lucas said carefully, directing his voice toward Wells, "we have been running in circles for hours, maybe we should at least take a look." Kramer turned on him immediately, irritation flaring. "There is nothing to look at," he snapped. "You start opening panels without cause, you create problems that were not there to begin with. Or you find the one that is," Lucas replied before he could stop himself, the words coming out faster than intended, and for a brief second the air tightened again, the chain of command bending under something it was not designed for. Wellesley's jaw set, his authority challenged not by Eli, but by his own airman, and that made the situation harder to dismiss. He looked back at the aircraft, then at the data screens, then finally at the panel Eli had pointed out, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face, small but undeniable. Eli shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the worn leather pouch at his side, the motion absent-minded, almost reflexive, and as his fingers traced the softened edge, something in his posture changed, not outwardly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but inside, something aligned, something long practice settling into place. He had seen this before, not this aircraft, not this moment, but this exact kind of silence, the kind that came when something small held everything back, something hidden behind perfection, something ignored because it did not fit the system's expectations. "You can keep waiting," Eli said quietly, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach all of them, "or you can listen." Kramer exhaled sharply, shaking his head, but he did not step forward this time, did not interrupt, and that hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed. Lucas looked at Wells again, and this time he did not speak, he just waited, the question hanging there without words. Wells held that gaze for a moment, then turned back toward the aircraft, his eyes settling once more on the panel, and the longer he looked, the more something about it began to feel off, not visibly, not in a way he could point to, but in a way that made the rest of the machine feel incomplete. The sun pressed down harder, the heat rising from the concrete in shimmering waves, and the silence of the aircraft felt heavier now, like it was no longer just broken, but waiting. Wells let out a slow breath, the decision forming before he fully understood it. "Open it," he said finally, his voice low but clear, and in that single moment, everything shifted. No one moved at first, as if the order itself needed a second to settle into reality, and then Kramer let out a short, disbelieving breath, glancing at Wells as if waiting for him to take it back, but the lieutenant did not, his eyes fixed on the panel now with attention that had not been there before, and that was enough to shift everything. "You heard him," Lucas said quietly, already stepping toward the tool cart, his hands moving with a careful urgency that contrasted sharply with the hesitation still hanging in the air. Kramer straightened, jaw tight, but he did not argue again, not this time, and that silence from him spoke louder than anything he had said all afternoon. The tools came out one by one, metal catching the sunlight as Lucas crouched near the panel, his fingers steady but his breath just slightly uneven, aware now that this was no longer routine, no longer just another maintenance task. Eli stepped back half a pace, giving space without stepping away, his eyes never leaving the aircraft, watching not the people but the machine, as if everything that mattered was already happening inside it. Lucas positioned the driver against the fasteners, pausing for a fraction of a second before applying pressure, the first turn breaking the factory seal with a faint, crisp snap that seemed louder than it should have been, a small sound that carried weight, like a line being crossed. One by one, the fasteners came loose, each click deliberate, each motion pulling them deeper into something they did not fully understand. The panel shifted slightly as the last one came free, just enough to reveal that it had not been sitting perfectly flush after all, just enough to confirm what Eli had felt without needing to say it again. "Careful," Wells said, his voice lower now, the sharp edge replaced by something closer to focus. Lucas nodded and eased the panel outward, the metal lifting slowly, revealing the inner assembly behind it, wiring, connectors, and structural components that looked exactly as the diagnostics had described them, clean, intact, with intolerance, and for a brief moment Kramer exhaled through his nose, almost relieved, almost ready to say something, until Eli's voice cut through again, quiet but absolute. "Not there," he said. Lucas froze, his hand still holding the panel, his eyes scanning what he could see, unsure where to look next. Eli stepped forward then, just one step, not rushing, not forcing, but certain, and he leaned slightly, his gaze moving past the obvious, past the components that looked perfect, to something tucked just behind the main line, something small enough to be dismissed, something no sensor would flag because it had not failed, it had simply shifted. He pointed, a single finger, steady and precise. "There," he said. Lucas followed the direction, squinting into the narrow space, and at first he saw nothing, just alignment, just order, and then, slowly, it revealed itself, a coupling just slightly out of position, not broken, not disconnected, just enough off to restrict what needed to move freely, just enough to silence everything without triggering a single warning. Kramer leaned in, his expression tightening as he saw it too, the confidence draining from his face in quiet increments. That should not affect ignition," he muttered. More to himself than anyone else. Eli did not respond. He reached down to his leather pouch, opening it with a familiar motion, the snap soft from years of use, and inside, among worn tools that looked older than anyone else on that tarmac, he selected one without hesitation, as if he had already known exactly what would be needed long before they opened the panel. The aircraft remained silent, but now it no longer felt empty, it felt held, waiting for the one thing it needed to be set right. Eli did not rush, and that was the first thing that felt different, no sudden movements, no urgency driven by panic, just a quiet certainty as he held the small tool between his fingers, its metal worn smooth from years of use, and for a moment he simply looked at the misaligned coupling, studying it as if confirming a conversation only he could hear. Around him, no one spoke. Kramer leaned in closer, his earlier confidence replaced by a tight, focused silence, while Lieutenant Wells stood just behind Lucas, his arms no longer crossed, his posture shifting from authority to observation. The heat pressed down, the air thick and still, and even the distant sounds of the base seemed to fall away, leaving only the faint creak of cooling metal and the soft brush of wind against the aircraft's frame. Eli reached in slowly, his hand steady despite the narrow space, guiding the tool with precision rather than force, adjusting the coupling by fractions so small they were almost invisible, movements measured not in inches but in instinct. It was never broken, he said quietly, more to the machine than to the men around him, just held in the wrong place. Lucas watched closely, his eyes tracking every motion, trying to understand not just what Eli was doing, but how he knew where to look in the first place, how he could see something that had remained hidden behind perfect readings and clean diagnostics. Kramer swallowed, his gaze fixed on the same point now, the logic he trusted unraveling in silence as he realized that the system had not failed, it had simply missed something it was never designed to detect. Eli made one final adjustment, a subtle shift that aligned the coupling exactly where it needed to be, and then he stopped, not immediately pulling his hand away, but holding it there for a brief second, as if feeling for something deeper, something beyond the physical, and then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. He withdrew the tool and stepped back, closing the leather pouch with a soft snap, the sound quiet but final. "Put it back," he said. Lucas did not hesitate this time. He moved quickly, carefully reseating the panel, securing each fastener with a steady rhythm, the clicks of metal threading back into place echoing in the stillness like a countdown no one had announced. Kramer remained silent, watching, his arms now hanging loosely at his sides, his earlier sarcasm gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Wells glanced toward the aircraft, then back at Eli, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the certainty in his voice. "That is it?" he asked, unable to keep a trace of doubt from slipping through. Eli did not answer right away. He turned his head slightly, looking once more at the engine housing, at the lines and curves of the machine, and for a moment his expression softened, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. "It is ready," he said simply. The word settled into the air, quiet and unforced, and for a second no one moved, the weight of what had just happened hanging between them, unresolved, unproven. Then Kramer shifted, almost reluctantly, reaching for the control panel on the cart, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before pressing the ignition sequence. The system responded immediately, lights flickering across the interface, the familiar startup cycle beginning exactly as it had before, but this time something felt different, something subtle, something none of them could quite name, as if the machine itself had finally been allowed to breathe. The ignition sequence continued, lights cascading across the control panel in a steady rhythm, each system coming online exactly as it had before, and yet the air felt different now, charged with a quiet tension that none of them could ignore, as if everyone was holding the same breath without realizing it. Kramer's eyes were locked on the readouts, scanning each line with renewed intensity, searching for any sign of inconsistency, any indication that something had changed beyond what he could explain, but the data remained clean, perfect, unchanged, and that was what unsettled him the most. "Fuel pressure stable," he muttered under his breath, more to anchor himself than to inform anyone else, ignition sequence nominal. Lucas stood just behind him, his gaze shifting between the screen and the aircraft, his chest tight, his pulse just slightly elevated, the memory of that faint misalignment still fresh in his mind, the realization that something so small had held everything back now impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Wells said nothing, his focus entirely on the aircraft, his earlier authority replaced by a watchful stillness, as if he understood that whatever happened next would redefine everything that had come before it. Eli stood apart from them, a few steps back, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes fixed on the engine housing, not waiting for confirmation, not needing it, simply present, as though he had already heard the outcome before it arrived. The system reached the final stage of the startup cycle, the moment where everything either aligned or failed, and for a fraction of a second, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the weight of anticipation pressing down on the tarmac. Then it came. A low, deep vibration stirred beneath the surface of the aircraft, subtle at first, almost hesitant, like something waking after a long silence, and then it built, growing stronger, steadier, the internal components aligning in perfect sequence as the engine caught and held, the sound rising into a powerful, controlled roar that rolled across the runway and pushed against the still air with undeniable force. The rotor blades trembled, then turned, slow at first, then faster, slicing through the heat haze as the aircraft came alive in a way it had refused to do all day. No one spoke. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a silence far heavier, far deeper, as each of them stood there, absorbing what they were hearing, what they were feeling, the undeniable truth of it settling into place. Kramer's hands dropped slowly from the controls, his eyes wide, not with excitement, but with the quiet shock of understanding that something he had dismissed had just rewritten everything he thought he knew. Lucas let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his gaze shifting toward Eli, searching for some reaction, some sign of acknowledgement, but Eli remained still, his expression unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in question. Wells took a step forward, the sound of the engine filling the space between them, and for a moment he looked at the aircraft, then at the panel that had been opened, then finally at Eli, the pieces connecting in a way that left no room for doubt. The machine was no longer silent, and neither was the truth that had just been revealed. The roar settled into a steady, controlled rhythm, no longer a burst of power but a sustained presence that filled the air with authority, the kind of sound that did not need to prove anything because it simply was, and for a moment the entire tarmac seemed to align around it, every loose movement, every uncertain thought falling into place beneath that deep mechanical certainty. Kramer did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the aircraft, but he was no longer looking at the engine, no longer tracking numbers or readings, he was looking at something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with systems or diagnostics, something that had just shifted inside him without warning. It should not have worked like that, he said quietly, the words almost lost beneath the hum, but no one corrected him, no one needed to, because they all understood what he meant, not the mechanics, but the moment. Lucas stepped back slowly, his gaze moving from the spinning rotor blades to Eli, and for the first time, he did not see an old man standing near a restricted aircraft, he saw someone who had walked into a problem no one else could solve and treated it like something familiar, something routine, something that had never been out of reach. Lieutenant Wells took another step forward, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by rank alone, but by something quieter, something earned in the space of a few minutes that had changed more than hours of procedure ever could. He stopped a few feet from Eli, close enough now to see the details he had missed before, the faded stitching on the jacket, the worn edges of the leather pouch, the calm in his eyes that had never once wavered. "Who are you?" Wells asked, the question simple, but heavier than anything he had said all day. Eli did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted briefly toward the aircraft, watching it run as if confirming that it was no longer being held back, and then he looked back at Wells, his expression unchanged, not guarded, not proud, just steady. "Someone who has seen this before," he said. The answer should have felt incomplete, but it did not. It settled into the moment with a kind of finality that made further questions feel unnecessary, and yet before anyone could speak again, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the steady hum, tires rolling fast across the concrete, deliberate, direct. Heads turned instinctively, eyes narrowing against the glare as a staff vehicle came into view, moving with purpose toward their position, not slowing, not hesitating. Kramer frowned slightly, stepping back from the control panel, his attention shifting for the first time away from the aircraft. "We were not expecting anyone," he said under his breath. Wells did not respond. He was watching the vehicle now, something in its speed, its direction, telling him this was not routine, not coincidence. The vehicle came to a sharp stop just beyond the aircraft, dust lifting briefly into the air before settling again, and the door opened almost immediately. A senior aide stepped out first, scanning the scene with a quick, assessing glance, followed by a man whose presence alone seemed to quiet the space even further, his uniform crisp, his posture carrying the weight of authority that did not need to be announced. He did not look at the aircraft. He did not look at the team. His eyes went straight to Eli. And in that moment, something deeper shifted, something that reached beyond the engine, beyond the fix, into a recognition that had nothing to do with what had just happened and everything to do with who had made it happen. The moment stretched, held in the steady thunder of the running engine, as the senior officer stepped forward, his boots striking the concrete with a measured, deliberate rhythm that seemed to carry more weight than sound, and yet no one moved to meet him, no one spoke, because something in his presence made it clear that this was not an interruption, it was an arrival. Lieutenant Wells straightened instinctively, his training snapping back into place, but even as he prepared to speak, the words never came, because the officer had already passed him, already moved beyond rank and protocol, his attention fixed entirely on Eli. The aide stopped a few steps behind, silent, watchful, as if he understood that whatever was about to happen did not require explanation. The officer came to a halt directly in front of Eli, close enough now that the contrast was unmistakable, one in a pristine uniform that reflected authority, the other in worn fabric that carried something deeper, something older, something that did not need to be displayed to be understood. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The engine continued its steady roar, the rotor blades cutting through the air with a rhythm that now felt almost like a backdrop, something constant beneath a moment that had shifted into something else entirely. Then the officer's posture changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention to itself, but enough, a subtle straightening, a quiet acknowledgement that moved through the space without a single word, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, precise, carrying the weight of recognition rather than authority. "Chief Vance," he said. The name landed differently than anything that had been said all day, not as a question, not as a guess, but as something known, something confirmed, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not visible, but absolute. Kramer felt it first, a tightening in his chest, a realization forming too quickly to process, his eyes shifting from the officer to Eli with a clarity that had not been there before. Lucas stood still, his breath quiet, his attention locked on the exchange, understanding now that the moment they had just witnessed was only part of something much larger. Wells did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, the pieces aligning in a way that made everything else fall away. Eli met the officer's gaze, his expression unchanged, no surprise, no reaction, just a quiet acceptance, as if this recognition belonged not to the present, but to something long established. "It is running," Eli said simply. The officer nodded once, his eyes briefly shifting toward the aircraft, taking in the steady rotation, the clean, controlled power, and then returning to Eli with the same calm certainty. "It always does when you are here," he replied. There was no announcement, no explanation, no need to elaborate, because the truth had already settled into the space around them, carried in the silence that followed, in the absence of doubt, in the way no one questioned what had just been said. Kramer lowered his gaze, the earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, not shame, not embarrassment, but understanding, the kind that arrives without warning and stays. Lucas drew in a slow breath, his posture shifting almost unconsciously, his shoulders straightening, his stance firming, and then, without being told, without looking to anyone for confirmation, he brought himself to attention. The movement was small, but it did not go unnoticed. Wells saw it, and a second later, he followed, the motion precise, deliberate, a recognition not of rank, but of something earned. Kramer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and then he did the same, the three of them standing there in quiet alignment as the engine continued its steady, unwavering rhythm. Eli did not move. He did not return the gesture. He did not need to. He simply stood there, as he had from the beginning, calm, steady, unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all, as if this moment was not a revelation, but a reminder. The aircraft roared on, no longer silent, no longer held back, and in that sound, in that steady, unbroken power, the truth settled into place without a single word needing to explain it, that some things are not proven by noise, but by the quiet certainty that remains long after it fades.